Okay, recording's begun. This is the Monday, April, what is it, the 7th maybe? Hold on.
8th.
Yeah, Monday, April 8th meeting of SIG Apps. Welcome all. This meeting's being recorded, so anything you say will be reserved for posterity indefinitely. We don't have a whole lot for today. There's no demos. I'm Ken Owens. If you don't know me, I'll be hosting. The other SIG co-chairs are out today, so no co-host. And primarily, I'm going to discuss some workload stuff, the caps that are in play and that we're looking at presently, and discuss some things about mentoring and what we might want to do with our owners files with respect to reviewers and approvers. So I'm going to start with the latter topic, actually. So one of the things that we looked at after talking to Paris was what kind of housekeeping do we need to do? And aside from cleaning up the SIG Apps main page in Kubernetes community, we also could do better probably with dealing with our approvers and reviewers. Like for the base owners file, we have no owners alias for SIG Apps approvers. We have kind of a makeshift collection of approvers. And then for reviewers, it's also kind of makeshift, and it's not clear to me that the SIG Apps reviewer, I don't think the SIG Apps reviewer's owner alias is actually used in the workloads API files, which probably isn't super fair to reviewers for various components of the API, and certainly doesn't make it easier. On top of that, there are people who went through basically reviewership training a while ago and have been acting as reviewers or in certain parts of the surface that aren't actually added as reviewers. They just are kind of jumping in and helping out where they can. So cleaning up the owners files, I think, is something we can do immediately to kind of improve that. My thought is to still leave some people who are obviously concerned with a particular portion of the workloads API and who have been contributing to it as owners of, well, reviewers at least, and approvers in some cases across the surface. Like there's like Mike Denise has contributed to daemon set, and Klaus is also very interested in daemon set because of the scheduling logic and the implications for moving to default scheduler, though he may not be at this point because that move is complete and most of the fallout from the move we've already worked our way through. So, but the notion of that change, and even that the daemon set has to deal with certain scheduling predicates, it might be good to keep him there as a reviewer or an approver. I don't think he's going to be contributing as actively at this point. So I want to clean those up and move a bunch of people into approvers who are kind of like localized approvers. Use the aliases across the files for what we own, and then probably add some people who I've looked at their contribution history, have enough contributions to warrant or at least reviewership. And from there, we can probably, if people are interested in becoming reviewers and approvers and so forth, set up something a little bit more like actively ask to be assigned reviews, and one of the reviewers will go through and find stuff for you to look at. There are plenty of open things that we could triage, and we could spread that out a little bit more. And that would be a good way to help people who are interested grow reviewership. Kind of questions I have is from the batch side. So like, are people who have been primarily working batch, but have also over the years contributed to the work, to the API in general, interested in being global reviewers, or do you want to just focus in batch?
I'm okay being a global reviewer. I don't see any problems with that.
Okay. And approvership?
Sure.
Okay.
Also, one question. When you will be putting together the PR, moving and reshuffling owners, approvers, and reviewers, can you send that one out over to SIG Apps mailing list. The reason for that is that will be a wider distribution of the fact, and it might be easier for everyone to be aware that this is the change that we are doing. GitHub notifications are not good for this. I'm not sure if you want to be pinging all of the people that we will be shuffling back and forth.
It's
So
actually not that many people. You'd be surprised. There's very few. but
seriously, I was actually hoping, given
uh,
the
you're
spread
right.
of
And yes, we will do that. We'll
control.
also ping SIG architecture, and we're going to need
Yeah,
somebody with root approvers to do it anyway, because I want to add
yeah,
a new owner's alias to the root owners. But talking to the guys from the SIG architecture and steering committee, they seem fine with the idea, and they're actually encouraging other SIGs to do something similar.
yeah, yeah. We're doing exactly same thing for 6CLI. Specifically, Phil was putting together a PR, deprecating some of the reviewers and approvers in the meantime. And yeah, that's definitely a very good move
Yeah. So
to actually do once in a while. I don't know, annually or something like that, more or
well,
less.
I think one thing that we can do, if we put it as owners' aliases and primarily use the aliases to control who's reviewing and approving in the particular um, files in the workloads API. And like at this point with V1, I think the right thing to do is kind of grow more global reviewership as opposed to people who are point specialists on particular areas of the surface. If we manage it from like a global root owners and owners file with approvers and reviewers, it's easier to add people, and it's easier for it to be clearly visible who the reviewers are and who the owners are, or approvers are. And I think that helps visibility. Right now, I mean, actually doing a review of who's in each file, it's really not, it's not out of whack. It's okay. It's fine. It's just like, and then there are a few people who have like either moved on, who aren't contributing actively. We consider removing them as we do the migration, but it's not so far off of base that I'm worried. Like 6CLI was in a slightly different place. They had very many people in owners files that
Exactly.
probably should never, like they should not be there at this point. So
That
we're not
that
that far
that
off.
yeah, that totally agree. Well, I was at some point in time considering that every controller, because I thought I was kind of thinking that at some point in time we got people focused on specific controllers only, and I know that this spread across the board.
I
And
mean, we totally did. Like there were a
right,
specific set of people working on daemon set, a specific set working on deployment, and that set had heavy overlap with replication controller. And then we have a specific set of people working
stateful set.
batch and
Yeah,
batch cron and cron job and
yeah,
job.
yeah,
That had a heavy overlap. Stateful set was kind of its own thing.
yeah.
But I'm looking at it now, and the way looking at the PRs and looking at the reviews, it seems like people have kind of broadened out already, and that's just kind of taking its natural progression, and building that expertise across the various controllers is something I think should be a goal.
Especially that if you, well, maybe that will be a slight over exaggeration, but given if you know one controller, you should be feel pretty confident skipping between controllers. Of course, each and every single of them will have some bits and nits that will be specific to that particular controller, but I'm hoping that those places are usually either covered by tests, please, or have a decent a comment explaining, yes, we did it because of this and that. So that's
So
my great hope.
our test coverage as a SIG is actually pretty good, and our
Awesome.
E2E coverage is actually pretty good. Our flakiness is much lower than it was a couple of years ago, so we're okay there.
True. Yeah.
Um, we I agree with what you're saying, and I think one of the things, the parts about understanding what the controller does and how that's implemented in code used to be kind of a lot more important than understanding the base infrastructure. But I feel like with the introduction of shared informer, like as the shared infrastructure has evolved a lot, I think the understanding of how a controller works and all of the intricacies around what you can do in the cache and the shared informer cache what happens when you mutate objects and why you should never ever do that, but why pointers are used instead of immutable copied, not even references, just copied structs. Like that understanding should be global. And if you understand like that much, like you're saying, you should be comfortable doing basic reviews. And hopefully the idea would be that you reach out to people who would be more experts if necessary, if you're not confident with the review.
Yeah, also the wide adoption of CRDs, which in majority of cases ends up people writing their own controllers for their own specific resources, allows to have a broader knowledge of the controller. So the basic knowledge is there. You just need to be willing to invest some time into looking in those PRs, ensuring that they match the level of conformance that we have, and ensuring they're a good fit for the project itself.
Yeah, and then the other thing we might get out of this is if we can hopefully find more commonalities in places where we might be able to refactor out to share a little bit more code across the controllers, that would be helpful too.
Oh yeah.
So we could do there might be some code cleanup that's available to be done in the not too distant future. And that's all I really had to say on it. Does anybody else have anything to add or want to talk about it more?
Yeah, I like that we will clean up the aliases and stuff, because we also have there are some shared tools, like I think controller refs manager, that's a separate tool which is shared for the controllers. So definitely the ownership could use a bit of a cleanup. And I think end-to-end tests have different owners as well, right?
Yeah, but it seems to me like everybody is a global owner of E2E tests across the entire service. So we need to. I'll try to take a look at that too and figure out what we can do there. I think we can, now that we've broken out and we have SIG Apps labeled tests that we're responsible for, make that ownership a little bit better as well. But the ownership mechanism there is a little bit different.
Yeah, I know. It's just usually if you add some feature or something.
You should add some tests for sure.
Yeah. Well,
one hopes we're not merging features with no tests.
Yeah, but that effectively means you may just lose your approval or something that you would have for your controller.
Yeah.
That you don't have there.
Okay. Okay, cool. So then the other stuff, I just want to talk about the current work in flight and kind of the way we've kind of been trying to grow contributorship isn't so much like for people who are interested in committing, we kind of start with like, okay, you've got some feature that you want or that you think should be done. And we try to help grow contributorship by shepherding that feature through the KEP process and in the implementation and letting the contributor actually build something in the system. And that's pretty much the way it's kind of always been for the most part. Like rather than doing a formal process for like do X number of reviews and this, that, and the other, it's been like you grow your contributorship by like generally identifying a need that you have, wanting to implement it, and then contributing that into the community. That process has gotten a little bit more complicated it's just gotten a little bit more complicated over the years. Now the current process is a KEP, which, we review, we'll give feedback on, and then when you open PRs, we'll review them, approve them, so forth. And that's a great way to get started contributing. For people who are kind of just interested in contributing to the project because they are really interested in Kubernetes and the Workloads API in particular, but they don't have something that they need to merge for their own use. The other way in terms of, reviewing PRs and, helping triage, that's another way to grow contributorship. But the primary way we've been doing it is through the KEPs. And I just want to kind of go over where various stuff is and see if anybody else wants to reach out and add comments. So the staple set max unavailable is merged currently, but I think we still need to add some, let me go ahead and just bring some of this up on my screen. Oh, here it is. Okay, zoom. Okay, can you guys see my screen?
Yep.
Okay, cool. So this cap is merged. I mean, I don't think anybody is against, or I haven't heard any strong arguments about why we should not do this. And I think we have a general idea of what we want to do here. But I think we might want to just go through it before we mark it as implementable and make sure that we're okay with the implementation. The sidecars PR is actually at a whip at this point, and we might want to go through and review here. I think it's mostly under node at this point. Dawn is assigned to it. There doesn't seem to have been a lot of review of it so far. So, I mean, someone from apps should probably take a look. I can do it if no one else is interested.
I was looking at the cap at the idea because it came from jobs specifically. Honestly, I still have some doubts whether we should be doing this. But first, the cap. I haven't looked into the implementation yet, but the cap is written in a reasonable fashion. It's explicit of how and what it is solving. So I'm still not in favor of the feature by itself by expanding kubelet with yet another container type. But overall, it
Looks reasonable.
Yeah,
So-
it's reasonable.
The job is one reason that people wanted the ability. You have a sidecar that interacts well with the container that terminates, or that isn't run always. But the actual main reason that people kind of got behind it was service meshes and service mesh integration. And like, there's two ways to kind of look at it. Like, one is you need to re-architect your application to live with sidecars and interact with sidecars in such a way that you don't have the lifecycle dependency on the sidecar, or that you're tolerant of the interaction between those two containers, which is a fair statement for, I mean, that should be a desirable goal for new things that are architected. I think the reason people are okay with implementing this to support like service mesh technologies is that, Kubernetes took an approach that was kind of different from some of the other container orchestration systems in terms of we wanted legacy applications that were containerized to work well on top of Kubernetes. And because of that, there's a lot of applications that can't actually tolerate the sidecar not being present. And like, they need that lifecycle orchestration to work for them in order to be able to be run on Kubernetes without being completely re-architected. And so feedback from the guys on the Istio and Envoy side were like, we should do this, we need to do this. And yeah, there is additional complexity, but some of the feedback from Tim, so there was actually some proposals out to do something as complicated as systemd, basically, that we'd have an arbitrary nesting of container ordering and have a mechanism to control dependencies. I don't think anyone wants anything that complicated. At least Tim definitely doesn't. So from the networking and node side, that was like a no. But one level of nesting was considered to be kind of sufficient to solve the problem. And generally helpful in making sure that if people adopt a service mesh on top of Kubernetes, which is becoming something that's fundamentally more and more popular to do, and even if you look at native integration with Istio, like if you want to use those technologies together, it becomes kind of important to be able to do the sidecar injection well. It's not, you know, the complexity versus the benefit. People are generally more toward it's beneficial.
Okay,
So
gotcha. I haven't
to me, I
considered.
was also kind of like, I don't think it's not my preferred way of solving this problem, but it kind of user demand was like, we really need this.
Yeah, I haven't considered and play myself with the service meshes on top of it, so I might have been missing that point. So having to
The
know
argument is
about
like,
that one, it does make sense. Yeah.
yeah, the argument is like you gave us mutating webhooks to specifically do container injection for the purposes of sidecars so that the user could go and write a system, not be aware of the service mesh or whatever sidecar has been injected. And then we can inject the sidecars via API machinery. And to say that like you expect us to architect the application so that it works well with the sidecar, even though the person who owns the application may not own the infrastructure that's doing the sidecar injection for either storage or network, for whatever they're doing it, was kind of like, you can't leave us like that. So, and then to me, that's fair.
Well, that sounds interesting. Like if you are actually modifying the pod template, like half of the workload controllers break, right?
No, the only one that was breaking was deployment, and that was if you modified. So if you modify the pod template spec in like the workload controller spec, you're going to have a problem. But that's not where the injection is done. The mutation is done on the pod spec, which actually works.
Well, that will break daemon sets, I think. Like we already had this with some admission webhook. Like,
well, we had an admission webhook that broke deployment because it was mutating the replica set. And that breaks because deployment does a comparison between the template specs to determine if something's been mutated. Daemon set and stateful set actually just label the end product. They label the pod and say, we think it's at this revision. And it takes into account that the pod that's created based on the template may be arbitrarily mutated by admission control before it becomes an actual pod. So we don't do pod like template for the actual pod, pod spec examination for the pod itself. So I think we're okay with daemon set and stateful set, and replication controller, replica set actually should work with admission control for for mutating webhooks if you only modify the pod spec. So that is safe to do. But like modifying the template itself is probably problematic. The API machinery guys, Daniel and Jordan, basically are like, yeah, just don't do that. So
I don't think this was modifying the pod spec. Like I recall a daemon set case where it was modifying the created pod through admission. And I think there is a still issue open. I think Janet was on there. I'm not sure if you have. I can actually find it. But
all right, yeah, let me take a look at that. Because there is another one that was open for stateful set where the same thing was occurring, but the user was basically implementing a mutating webhook that was ill-formed. So that wasn't either the fault of the controller or the fault of the API machinery or a paradigm kind of cognitive dissonance thing. It was just a poorly written webhook.
Yeah.
And there have been other issues we've seen with admission. Like mutating webhooks are in general a very powerful tool that don't always interact well. So it's like kind of, you really have to know what you're doing in order to make it work. That's without setting up the PKI infrastructure that's necessary to communicate safely with the API server to execute your webhook effectively. Like, just, it's a lot. But as CRDs go toward GA, I think the default way for defaulting and validation is going to be, defaulting will be a mutating webhook, and then validation will be a validating webhook. So they're going to get more popular. We should probably be prepared for them.
Yeah, like I can check the daemon set, but I think that's the case where we actually compare the daemon set pod template actually matches the pod, or we will just delete it and create a new one?
Yeah, when we added controller history, we got rid of that logic initially. We were comparing basically, we were just making sure the pod was labeled with the correct controller revision, as opposed to doing a direct comparison between the template of the daemon set and the spec of the pod. So if that creeped back in, I would be surprised, but I wouldn't be shocked.
Yeah, I will look for the issue. But I recall this was like writing half of the writes on etcd when it started hot looping. So it's in live memory.
Yeah, I'm not doubting that this is true. The other thing is we have this kept from the guys at Pinterest, which is interesting, but I'm not sure if it's something we necessarily want to do. I think I brought it up last week. It would be good if we had some other people take a look at it. They're basically proposing to start adding, I guess the best way to say it is lower disruption updates. So kind of like looking at determining if you can do an update in place.
That can actually mean higher disruption if you have just one pod.
Yeah.
I'm not sure. Like in place updates, they're like, I'm not sure.
Well, the only thing we can do right now, in all honesty, is do it for an image, right? Like that's the only thing that's mutable on a pod spec. So that would be the only thing we can touch. Then there's the interaction, like we just discussed a minute ago, with mutating webhooks, which may in fact modify the container prior to actually launching it in such a way that you can't actually tell if you're doing the right thing. If you start doing image inspection or the fields of the pod spec, that could cause controller tight looping. Then there's the fact that, like, because we can't resize the container, I don't know how valuable it actually is. Like, if all you want to do is an image, the way to do that might be doing something in the open source, like, base of Kubernetes that did image streams, which is kind of a feature in OpenShift right now. And thinking about it in terms of rolling out image streams might be a better way to look at this problem. But they want to do it for stateful set and daemon set. Like image streams is usually more useful for deployment. So, but
we actually use image stream for everything. It's on a higher level. Like it will inject the image into the deployment, and then normal rollout will happen. Like it's not like image stream would work on a lower level.
Right. So, but when they do an OpenShift, if do you actually do a mutation directly on the container and try to do it in place, or is it still doing a rolling update on the deployment?
So there are actually two types of, well, image stream is the object that actually holds the image. And then there are two options. You can have one admission that will actually change the image in the pod that's being created as an admission hook. And the other one that we settled up for is that you link it to your deployment, and it will inject the image into the deployment, and normal rollout will happen since then.
Well, in short, it depends whether we're talking about resources that are available in OpenShift natively. For those, we do support directly working with image streams. For the resources that are coming from Kube API, we always work through admission, which is replacing the image based on whether you want it or not, and you need to annotate the image stream or label image stream with the information whether it is possible for it to be used in a workload.
Okay.
More or less, that's basically how it works.
Okay. Well, I think we should at least give them feedback. I'm not convinced this is something we should do. But it would be good if other people had time to chime in and just say, well, have you thought about this? And maybe this isn't something that you actually want to do, even though you think you do. The volume claims, the volume expansion cap, and there's a corresponding cap for in-place resize, which is basically like if your storage supports online file system resizing, is still not merged, but not from us. Because I think this was approved by SIG Apps. I think it's just waiting on SIG storage approval. I reached out to Saad and Michelle. And I'm not sure why they haven't approved it yet, but I'd like to get this in sooner than later because basically everyone is supporting at a storage level in current versions of Kubernetes resizing volumes, and stateful set is still fairly popular to use even when people are writing custom controllers that are workload specific for databases. Like a lot of them are still using stateful set under the hood as a primitive. They've just written custom orchestration on top of it. So being able to resize disks kind of is a super important feature for those people, I feel like. So I'd like to get this in sooner or later. I'll see if the author wants to try to go at the implementation, because what they've proposed is mostly sane so far. If not, then something either I'll write or somebody from SIG Apps is totally welcome to contribute if they're looking to make a code contribution for this one. The PDBGA is still open. We haven't merged that yet. Morton is currently working on looking at how we can make this work with the scale sub resource. So the current implementation only works with the built-in types, the built-in workload types, basically. I don't know. So if we like the API and we're okay GAing that, I mean, I could be convinced that it would be okay to GA the API as is and then add support for the scale sub resource later, maybe. But I think that what we'd like it to do is act more like the HPA controller and be able to act on anything that has a scale sub resource. Scale sub resource is available on CRDs, I think, since 1.13. So if somebody writes a custom controller that deploys pods directly and doesn't use a workloads primitive under the hood to manage the pods, I'd like them to be able to also benefit from disruption budgets. So Morton's taking a look at what it looks like to actually do that. I think the reason why I'd consider it kind of a GA blocker is because I'd like to see it deployed and operating on the scale sub resource just to make sure that it works, and it works in a way that's not crippling to the API machinery prior to saying that the whole thing is generally available. I mean, part of it is making the API, saying the API is stable, but the other thing with GA is we're usually saying we think the implementation is stable enough that it won't break you. And we're not going to have to change it in backward incompatible ways. And if we supported the scale sub resource and then decided later that, okay, we can't support it, or it's broken, or like, yeah, this is horrible, there'd be no way to back that out. Like once we decide we're going to support the scale sub resource from an implementation perspective, removing that would be backward incompatible for sure. All of a sudden you'd turn up a cluster and previously you had PDBs associated with the CRD and they just worked. Now this new version doesn't work or behaves differently with respect to CRDs. And you know, the availability guarantees that you're trying to provide via the disruption budget just aren't there anymore. So I think we probably want to at least see the scale sub resource supported. The other feedback I was wondering is anyone, so we added max unavailable instead of min available because it allowed you to use a PodDB and not have to mutate it frequently. It was just a cleaner expression of disruptions in terms of the way people generally think of them. The other kind of thing I was wondering is, do we want to keep min available? Because when Anirudh did the initial addition of the max unavailable, he didn't add it to, he wanted to just replace it altogether, but we couldn't do that in a backward compatible way. So GA is a chance to break backward compatibility. I'm not too having both. I don't see it as hurting anybody, so I'm not too like gung ho that we need to do it one way or the other. But if anyone else's feedback, it would be a good time to give it now.
Are you saying we can remove a field from beta to GA?
You could. You might have to do a V1 beta 2, but I think you could actually just offer a GA version with that field removed and then support it in V1 beta 1 and deprecate it, have the two coexist, and then remove it, if I remember the rules correctly. If not, it will require a V1 beta 2 with the field removed and then promote that to GA.
Yeah, I thought we need to do another version, but I would have to.
I'd have to go look at the rules and talk to the API guys and make sure that I'm not talking out of turn. You may be correct.
I mean, I was just asking Ken. Like, I don't recall the rules exactly. I know there were issues.
Yeah, I'm saying I don't either, and I do remember doing the V1 beta 2 for the workloads APIs. But the primary motivation there was to just put something out into production and let people use it and make sure that we were confident that we had the right thing to promote to GA. I don't think it was part of the deprecation and support policy for why we did that. But I also am not sure is my general thesis. So it is something worth checking out.
Right.
And then the other thing is, so Janet and I met with Barney, who's going to author the cron job KEP GA. KEP, and he's a guided starting on it, so we're hoping to see that soon. He just wanted some feedback on exactly what problems we thought needed to be solved and what we think about the API in general prior to opening it up more broadly. And the conversation didn't really change from the original conversation that we had a couple of months ago. Like I think everyone's okay with the API as is. The main thing we want is shared informers and to make sure that any bugs that remain open are cleaned up and that we have a good working API for GA, working implementation, and that we wanted to release the shared informers version as an alpha feature and kind of progress that up stability just so that we don't break anybody's clusters on cron job as we do it. So I think we should see the cron job GA kept from him in the near future. And then we'll probably need some help from the community in terms of reviewing implementation and all of the above.
Do we have any written documents with regards to how the planned KEP will look like or stuff like that?
He's just going to follow a regular KEP, but I mean, the graduation criteria will be in there. He's going to describe what is going to be done, but not necessarily the details. I think probably PRs are a better way to talk about the actual code, unless you want to see something separate, in which case, we can always.
No. I was just curious whether some work in progress KEP was laying around on someone's, I don't know, GDoc or something like that, that I could have a look at and provide some early feedback.
Yeah, I mean, there is like a whip Google Doc, but I'm just like, pull it and let it. There's no need to do this internally or in a smaller group, in my opinion. I'm just like, open it, let people comment. It's not overwhelming. You'll be fine. So.
Yeah, it's definitely, it'll take some time to get through, but yeah, definitely.
I mean, but yeah, so like, I think, I don't see any pressure to just make it GA just to say it's done. Like, I think we want to GA it in a state where we're happy with it, right? So correctness is more important than timeliness.
Exactly.
So everyone's on that page, so it should be fine.
Yeah, I just want to ensure that, there was some discussion that we need to graduate cron job as soon as possible because we graduated everything else. And I'm like, yeah, but everything else is different than cron job. And we've been trailblazing lots of stuff with cron jobs, either migrating from promoting from one version to the other, or whatever else that we would been dealing with for the cron job implementation.
Yeah, I mean,
and the worst case is it was never, the main problem, because cron jobs, everybody loved it that we have it, but nobody was able to devote 150% of their time to push it further. And we kind of stayed at a point where we were happy with what we currently have.
So another thing we might want to think about doing in the future, at least, is taking a look at the batch workloads API, and maybe offering extensions as a SIG, not necessarily something that's built in, but doing like CRDs and custom controllers that extend the API to do batch a little bit differently. Like there's a lot of stuff in the community around open kind of CRDs for batch APIs, like Kubeflow as a TensorFlow job for machine learning. I could definitely see, if you wanted to do something a little bit more high throughput, how the job API might not be the best thing for you. I think cron job is one of the ones where it's like, I don't know if there's anything to improve on, to be honest. I mean, most of the people who want, like, I want to run this job iteratively, they're not using it for high throughput batch. They're using it as like a cleanup task or like an administrative task.
There is one thing in the job controller that I would like to get fixed at some point in time, sooner than later, which is the way we calculate the status of a job. It requires all of the pods of a job to be present.
That's kind of a problem. But let me ask you.
That's probably the only one. And only if you run more than, 10, 20 pods per job. If in smaller batches, you will not see a problem.
In smaller batches, you don't. The only other thing I could figure is that maybe you could do. So the problem that I've seen with this is that eventually pod GC kicks in.
Yes.
And it starts reaping the pods before the job is done, and you get jobs that run forever, which is like a real thing. You could maybe use finalizers to prevent the GC from kicking in, because the necessity. So I was looking at this particular issue not too long ago with a bunch of other people from API Machinery and Node, just trying to figure out why. So why are the pod GC settings what they are today? Why did we add the controller, and do we still need it at this point? Because I thought it was probably a storage pressure issue on Node, but it actually isn't. It was a CPU pressure on a component that wasn't using pagination, which doesn't actually do it anymore. So like there are things we can do here to make that particular problem better. But so job is V1 as it is. We had a V2 alpha. Do we want to try to do a V2 job, or do we just want to do something different as another API for job outside of core? I don't know.
I'm not sure we need a new API to solve this particular problem, but I was rather envisioning that we could improve the controller to be more aware of the pods so that they could be removed. Maybe something along the calculating SHA or whatever that deployment does to be able to figure out that, yes, we are currently at the version that we care about and not any other. So something along these lines, but I never got the time to actually
take a look at it.
Yeah.
So what I saw one interesting implementation where so technically the status of the job object should be calculated from what it observes in the cluster if you're being Kubernetes native. But you can also add an intermediate object that basically acts as a counter, whose spec can be updated so that the job can determine, like, this is how many pods I've actually launched. So you can have another intermediate, like, kind of implementation detail object that you use as a counter to kind of track the status of the current job as it's running, so you don't care about the pods getting garbage collected. And that I saw someone who's actually implemented that, and it was an interesting way to do it. The thing I'm not super sure about is, can we do that and still say, like, can we do that in a backward compatible way?
Can you do it with expectations or caching?
Well, you're not changing the the backwards compatibility in any way. You are expanding the current information about a status object, and the current status will still be updated as is. And the fact that you're using additional helper objects to have a intermediate data, I don't see that as a breaking backwards compatibility in any way.
That's fair. I mean, but it just kind of changes. Well, I guess if you're considering the current behavior a bug, then it's a bug fix, right?
Yeah, exactly.
That's fair.
Yeah. It is a problem. We know about the problem since literally day one. And that was a conscious decision when we made it back then. That, yes, we will have to fix it at some point in time. The fact that we never fix it is a feature.
I mean, and then there's the
fact
other
that it's there, it's a bug.
The other way we could do it is, like, you could, in theory, just add the finalizer, and assuming that we've cleaned up the implementation of the other components that were, so like the thing that was breaking was listers on other system components. If we added finalizers to make sure that the pods weren't garbage collected and we can actually stand to have that many pods lying around listed, that fixes the problem too.
Yeah, but it's risky.
It's riskier.
It's the problem with this approach would be that you might end up in a situation where you will be draining your node possibilities because you are creating or keeping around 100 of unused pods, and you cannot remove them because the job has not finished for whatever reason.
Oh yeah, there are definitely implications for, so you're saying basically I have a node, I have all these pods, I can't, my eviction doesn't work if I'm doing something like a rolling node upgrade, because I have all these pods stuck around in the terminating state because I have this batch job that's continuously running but not finished.
Yeah, you might end up doing something like that, and that kind of sucks, honestly. If we would do that finalizer, then I would say that should be optional.
Oh yeah, it would definitely be opt-in. I think for people who are using job intensely and they're trying to do high throughput batch across their clusters, the node churn would be less of a problem because, I mean, basically they're usually going to be auto scaling up based upon the pressure that they're putting on the cluster anyway. And the scale down would be if their job is completely done. It would be a resource waster for sure, though. Like, you'd have to wait for the job to fully complete before you actually GC all those pods and you can scale back down. So it might. Yeah. I think
that's why the additional information, the additional resource, is, well, in a way, lesser bad, or whatever the English saying for that one is. But it's something that I'm willing to accept more willingly than the finalizer.
That's fair. I mean, I think taking a look. So I think I still would like to understand how bad the finalizer behaves in the average case. Maybe it's not.
It won't be a problem in average case. From what I've seen, the average case is a couple of pods. That's all. Even if the case is, yes, my job is running for, I don't know, 50, 60 hours, that's still not a problem if it's creating 10 pods. That's
no, not at all
negligible. Even if that would be 50, then that's okay. But when you're talking about 100 plus, that kind of sucks. And 100 plus with a duration of a week or so, that's becoming problematic. So
yeah, actually I'm talking about average case for high throughput batch. So I'm thinking more along the lines of thousands of pods.
Okay.
than the 100. I think, I mean, like for people who are doing the things you're talking about, they tend to not be troubled, at least from what I've seen.
Yeah, that's true.
Like it's only the people who are like, I'm going to scale this up and I'm using job as a batch primitive to like get relatively high throughput batch workloads running on top of Kubernetes. And like the thing I'm concerned about is just what we talked about before, but also what that interaction looks like if they want to use it with other workloads. And then like, it's one thing on cloud where you can do different types of capacity planning and resource allocation. Like I can have a separate node pool just for my batch, and then have a separate node pool for my serving workloads and stateful, and then it can have different machine shapes for each of them. And if I'm looking to get better utilization, it's pretty easy on most clouds now for me to choose arbitrary machine shapes. Like I can make my own SKUs that fit whatever I want. I'm more concerned for people on-prem who like, you know, I buy a SKU and it's a fixed size and I'm trying to run this on bare metal. And what I really need to do to get better utilization is fill holes in the shape of the SKU with batch work, right? So like for them, the cost savings and the cost optimization is predicated on the ability to run batch workloads well, along with serving workloads and stateful workloads. And that's a use case I haven't really, I've seen people exploring very in a great deal yet. There are a couple of large companies who are doing Kubernetes on bare metal, but they don't, most of them aren't doing like batch optimization at that point or that level yet, or at least not that they've communicated.
Okay, gotcha.
But I mean, I don't know. What's the new thing? Oh, what is it called? They're using components of OpenStack to make it easier to run Kubernetes on bare metal.
I don't think I heard about that one.
Okay, it's a Red Hat thing.
Yeah.
But it's relatively new. They just announced it recently. It seems like that's going to be a thing. So we should make sure that the use case for co-locating batch and stateful or stateless workloads is doable, I would think.
So is there an issue related to this that you're talking about, or a cap?
For which one? For job?
For the GC, the terminated, and the GC
for job
the
GC?
terminated
I don't know if we've actually opened an open source issue. I think there is.
I think there was one.
It's something that is known enough, I guess.
I might even own the issue.
Yeah,
and I opened that one myself.
But to your point, there probably should be. If there isn't one, we should probably open one.
I hope that I've opened
so
one.
One issue that we recently saw with the terminated pods was not related to jobs. Basically, we saw that the default value of when that GC kicks in is 12,500. And we have seen that due to some recent changes, when kubelets restart, they reset the extended resource sizes, and that leads to pods getting evicted and terminated in the terminated state. So we end up with a lot of these pods in the terminated state, and the GC never happens until it reaches 12,500. So I mean, is the limit for 12,500 something that is coming out of jobs?
It was sort of. I mean, job is the most common use case that we've seen it pop up. And the interaction with job can be particularly bad because once the garbage collection kicks in, the job may never complete and you just have this constant churn. The actual problem that was control plane that broke the control plane was listers, and the number of pods that were set up, the GC had to be put in because when, I forget what component it was, when the pod listing was happening, it was causing CPU burn. Like basically the duty cycle of the CPU got eaten alive and was causing control plane instability. So they set the GC threshold and added the garbage collector to prevent listers across the board from like just breaking everything. But with pagination, the problem with listing that many pods is largely mitigated. So the kind of current thinking is that pod GC might not even be fully necessary anymore.
So when will the terminated pods be cleaned up? Then they will be immediately cleaned up? So you're saying that pod GC may not be necessary, then when will the terminated pods be cleaned up?
Well, the threshold would just be much higher. They would probably do it disk pressure based as opposed to having a GC threshold that's less than that.
Okay.
Okay, so we're running out of time. Does anybody have anything else they want to add before we close up? Okay. All right. Then I'll see everybody next week. Same time, same channel. Thanks for coming.
Thanks, folks. Bye.
Thanks again. Bye.